Hi everyone. We're going to take a look today at how to do revision and editing, and I'm going to start right from the course homepage. This may or may not be your actual course, but the structure is going to look the same either way. I'm going to switch myself over into student view. I forgot to do that, so that'll just flash for a second. There we go. And now what we're going to do is click on content and Unit 1, essay writing. And then down here, we've got right near the bottom, we've got revision and editing. I'm going to click on that. And this is something that I created right within Brightspace. And so it's got this little arrows thing here. You could download it if you wanted to. I'm not actually sure what file format you would get if you did that. But if you want to just look at it on your screen and make it bigger, get rid of all this extra stuff, you can click this four-way thing and it's going to get nice and big. And then you would hit escape or click on this exit full screen to get back to your normal view. All right, so revision and editing. First of all, a common misconception. Aren't they the same thing? No, they are not. They are two steps in a process. They're different. Revision should always happen first, followed by editing. So let's work our way through exactly what they are. Revision is a process that has to do with logic and organization. You're looking at your content here, not your wording, not how you wrote it, but what you wrote. It looks for and solves the big problems. It involves adding, deleting, or moving entire paragraphs or sentences. It can involve even going back to your source material to look for specific missing details. In poetry, it involves revisiting line breaks and stanza breaks, changing rhymes or rhythm if they're out of kilter, checking back for that perfect word where maybe you had a generic placeholder. Always, no matter what the form you're using, check for specificity and impact. Have you expressed all of your ideas with specific and concrete touch points? And is your work likely to have the impact on your audience that you hope it will? As I said, revision should always be done first before editing. There is literally no point in editing until you have revised. So here are the steps. Step 1, overall, you're going to check that you have fulfilled the intention of the assignment. I don't care how well you did it. If you didn't do the right thing, it's not going to give you a very good mark. So this is where you're going to check back and make sure that you actually did what you were supposed to do. You're going to go back to the instructions and be sure you can answer yes to the following questions. Some might not be applicable to all forms. Use the one that makes sense for your current assignment. And if you can't say yes to something, then fix it. Okay, so first of all, have I demonstrated the kind of thinking skills that the assignment asked me to practice? You're going to look for the verbs here, things like analyze, argue, compare, contrast, explore, predict, synthesize. What are you being asked to do in the assignment, and have you done it? Next, you're going to make sure you wrote the right genre of document. This sounds ridiculous, but I have actually many times, I would say on average once per assignment, had someone turn in the wrong thing. The worst I ever had was someone who turned in a very well-written short story when they had been asked to write a poem. Now, if you've written both of those, you might realize that for most people, a short story takes longer and is more challenging than one poem. And this person had done an excellent job of writing a short story. But when it came for me to mark it like it was a poem, it didn't do very well. It, in fact, failed. And I went back to the person and said, look, great short story, put this in a file folder for later in the course, but that wasn't what you were supposed to do here. So make sure that you have written the genre of document. In this case, for the assignment that I'm talking about right now, you've been asked to write an essay. So make sure that you actually wrote an essay. A minimum of 5 paragraphs, not 1 paragraph. It's not a research report, so you've got a lot of opinion mixed in there. You're not just telling me about what you read in your sources. You're adding in your opinions and your analysis. That's what an essay does. Okay, next, have I used the concepts and methods discussed in the course? So when we get to the end of a unit, we typically have a culminating activity. And what's happening with that is that you're being checked on your ability to do the things that you have just been taught. So look back at what you've been learning lately, and have you used that to generate your assignment? Because if you have, that's where you're going to get the best possible mark. If your course introduced new theoretical terms, use some of them in your work. If you learned about new forms or methods, have you used them? For the essay assignment that we're working on right now, the things that we're going to be looking for are, have you used accurate paragraph structure? That paragraph structure that we started with near the beginning of the course, that is what we expect to see in your supporting paragraphs. Have you used good essay structure? You had a whole presentation on that. Have you done your research? Have you chosen reliable sources for your research? Have you cited your sources using MLA format? And have you used the tools of persuasion? These are the things that you've learned about lately, so these are the things that should go into writing your essay. Am I retelling too much? Most high school, college, and university assignments require more advanced skills than just proving that you understood a text or a concept. In essays, you want to add your opinions and analysis running all through your work. Okay, so your ideas, your opinions, your analysis should be in that whole thing from beginning to end. In creative writing, you want to be sure that you evoke emotion and express a message in addition to just providing an experience. So with that, you're also going to ask yourself, on the one hand, you want to do these overall things, but you also want to give enough and specific enough evidence to support your analysis, or for creative work, you want to use enough detail and be specific enough to provide a real experience rather than a fuzzy hint of an experience to your audience. So remember our tree drawings back at the beginning of the semester. Can the audience to your work see not just a tree, but the tree that you want to express? Have you given them the facts and the evidence, in the case of an essay, to really understand why you believe what you believe? Have I clearly cited sources for any quotations, information, or ideas that are not my own? So you're going to want to use the in-text citations. You're going to want to put a works cited list at the end of your assignment. Have I used enough sources, and are they the right kind? So for this particular assignment that we've just been working on, you want a minimum of 3 sources. So that's what enough sources looks like. And the right kind are reliable sources. You've got those checklists you can work through to make sure your sources are reliable. So if all of this is in place, then you have met the requirements of the assignment. That's step 1. Next, step 2, you're going to check your organization. When you're doing that, consider these questions. Anything that you write or speak should basically have an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion. The specifics of what that looks like changes from form to form, but everything has that basic structure of introduction, middle, and conclusion. So does your introduction make it clear where your work is headed? Check this by asking someone whose opinion you respect to read it. And for an essay, paraphrase your thesis. Or for if you're writing a research paper, ask them to tell you what your research question was, and check that you have each of the following in your introduction. For an essay, you should have a clear thesis that could be lifted from your paper and quoted and would stand alone. So if somebody has read your introduction and they kind of have a fuzzy idea about where you're going, but there is not one sentence in there that they can pick out and say, that's the thesis, then even though you might have a thesis in your head, you haven't put it on the paper or on the screen in this case. So make sure you get that. For a research paper, you should have a clear research question, a focus of what you were trying to find out. That's the similar thing to a thesis in an essay. For a poem or short story, your introduction should help your audience understand what your piece is generally about. And for any of these that are relevant, it should have a basic beginning sense of your characters and your setting. Next, for all of these forms, you're going to provide some background information about your topic to bring your reader up to your starting point with the information needed to understand your work. So any background details that they need to know, even to understand the rest of what you're saying, that should all go in your introduction. For your essay, you need to have a summary of your main arguments. And I'm specifying the word summary here. Don't start giving me all your evidence in your introduction. Just give me basically like your topic sentences for your 3 supporting paragraphs. And then you also need something at the very beginning to draw in readers and make them want to read on. This can be called a hook. It can be a controversial question, a controversial statement, a question, a quotation, an interesting or surprising fact, or a very short anecdote, a striking image, any of these things that's really going to pull in your reader and make them want to keep reading. Because in any form of writing or speaking, a really good one is going to have something that makes the reader or the listener want to be there. Let's face it, I'm going to read your essays because I have to. It's my job. But I would appreciate it if I enjoyed reading your essays. That might actually even improve your mark. Okay, in each supporting paragraph or section, is it in the right place for your purpose? So where I'm heading with this is I want to tell you about the rule of primacy and recency, which is something from psychology. Readers remember, or listeners, remember best what they read or what they heard first and last. They tend to kind of lose track of the middle. So if it makes logical sense, try to put your strongest points, whether strongest in emotion or logic, in your first and your last supporting paragraphs in an essay. In a research paper or an essay where logic demands a particular order of arguments, spend the most time revising your first and last supporting paragraphs. In a poem or short story too, you want your most impactful material to come at the beginning and the end if it can do so while still making sense. Okay, so once you've got all of that sorted out, next thing to look at is for everything that's in there, is it necessary? If it isn't, cut it out. Speaking as both a teacher and an audience for a lot of written material, I would rather read 500 well-written and concise words than 1,500 words that blather and repeat needlessly. That's why I very rarely give a word count, because I want you to use the number of words that you need to make your point. And I do not want you to keep going on and on once your point has been made. The flip side of that, though, is ask yourself, is anything missing? If so, add it. This can sometimes mean going back to your sources if you did research. So if you're reading through your paper and you realize, ooh, I expressed an opinion here, but there's nothing to back it up, go back and find yourself a fact that's going to back that up. And then the final question, does your paper flow? So you're going to look especially at the connections between paragraphs or sections. This is where you're going to want to pull out those transition words we've been talking about. So look at your topic sentences to see if they link back to what came before. Now, the higher level way of doing this, instead of with our transition words, is with logic. And it's more customized than simply just using moreover and so on and all of that. So if you can and you would like to take your work to the next level, there is a resource on how to do that down at the bottom of this. That is not an expectation of this course, though, so I'm not going to go into it right now. It's just something you could look at if you want to push yourself to go to the next step. All right, and finally, does your conclusion make it clear what question you asked and how you arrived at the answer? Does it move beyond your initial research question or thesis to consider what next questions, implications, or in general, to answer the question of so what? In a short story or poem, does it punch home the final impression that you hope to leave with your audience? That's what your conclusion should do. It should wrap things up and it should leave the correct impression on your audience. So once you're happy with all of this, you've got your basic writing done. Now you want to go back and edit and make sure that it's correct. So editing means checking for spelling, grammar, and style. That's boiled down what editing is. So obviously, before editing, you need to have all the writing you want present and in the order it will appear in your final product. That's when you're ready to start looking at your spelling and grammar. There is no point in editing a sentence or a line of poetry that you'll later delete. That's why we do editing after revision. So the steps to edit. Number 1, check your word choice, sentence structure, grammar, punctuation, and spelling. If any of this is non-standard, be sure that you meant it to be that way. Normally, you would use non-standard spelling for creative writing. Sometimes you would do it in poetry and short stories, novels, not so much in an essay. It isn't impossible. There are some very strong reasons to sometimes use a sentence fragment, for example, and we'll talk about those as we work on through the course. But just be sure that if there's anything that's not standard, you've done it on purpose. Other than that, though, correct any errors you find. So how are you going to do this? Something you can do is to read aloud some or all of your work, especially any longer sentences. Look for places to use short sentences for emphasis of key ideas. This is something that a lot of people find surprising, but actually short sentences are more impactful than long ones. If you can make your point in a short sentence, especially if you bury it surrounded by long sentences, it's going to jump out at the reader and it's going to hammer home your idea more effectively. So look for places where you can use short sentences to emphasize your most important points. If you find a sentence that you can't read aloud in a single breath with expression, consider cutting it up, if not into separate sentences, then at least with strong punctuation, such as a semicolon or a dash. For poetry or spoken word, pay attention to the sound of the words themselves. Do they create the impact you had hoped for? If not, can you make changes that will be more impactful? I'm going to say this right out. Use spell check. It's right more often than it's wrong. So if you believe it's wrong, be very sure. Never leave a spell check or grammar marker unresolved before turning in your assignment. Always check and make sure that if it's telling you something is wrong, you're sure it's not actually wrong. At the same time, don't completely trust spell check. Check your own spelling as well. Especially when your misspelling in fact creates a different word, spell check can miss things. Worse yet, it can correct things that weren't wrong. It's horrible for doing this for names. So really double check the names and make sure that spell check hasn't fixed them for you. Okay, next up, review word choices. As much as possible, use simple, clear, but specific words that are part of your everyday vocabulary. You'll use these with the most confidence and power. If you use a thesaurus, don't trust it. It categorizes words overly broadly, so that most of the choices it offers are appropriate in only some contexts. Before using a new word in your writing, look it up in a dictionary that offers usage suggestions to make sure you're using it correctly. Similar to spell check, don't depend on or ignore a grammar checker. These have improved a lot in recent years, so they're much better than they were, for example, when I was in high school. But they still sometimes offer mistaken guidance, and they especially tend to get tripped up with longer and more complex sentences. Never trust them completely, but always consider and explore their suggestions. And then finally, for those of you that don't have English as your first language, don't depend on, but do consider using a translation website. Like grammar checkers, these have improved a lot in recent years. They can be helpful in allowing you to express complex ideas that maybe your English hasn't quite arrived at yet. For English to French and vice versa, I like deepl.com. It's a really good site. It may work for other languages too, but those are the only two that I speak, so they're the only ones I can be sure of. This website's advice is often good, it's often helpful, but it is not perfect. So especially beware of using verb conjugations and grammatical structures whose meaning you don't understand. One of the classic ways that teachers try to figure out if you've plagiarized or if you've done your own work is to ask you to explain yourself. If you can't, that can be problematic. So if you've relied on a translation website, make sure that you can understand everything that it has given back to you. And then the final step, we hope, is to mark yourself. Once you've finished revising and editing, if you've been given a rubric or a marking scheme, as you have in this case, use it to mark yourself. Decide if you're happy with your self-awarded mark, or if you need to look again at any part of your work. This can lead to a full repetition of the revise, edit, and mark yourself process, but it can be worthwhile. Professional writers of any kind repeat this whole process not just once, but many times before publishing their work. So think about turning in your final product as a form of publication and be willing to do this cycle more than once. Okay? So here's my works cited list in MLA format mostly. I'm just going to say I'm aware that in MLA format this should be hanging indented, but Brightspace won't do it. So just imagine the hanging indent. And here's the WayLink language resources. This is the link that I talked about more advanced ways of linking the transitions between your paragraphs. So you can check that out if you're interested. All right, so we're going to exit full screen now, and I'm going to turn this off.